Hello again, I'm Ben Austin, Operations Director at Tisski, and welcome back to our GDPR Primer series. So this is the second video in the series, and today we'll be taking a look at the core principles of GDPR, how they compare to the current provisions in the UK's Data Protection Act, and what, if anything, those changes mean for organisations like yourselves. Now, in this video we'll be using various terms from the GDPR that we looked at and defined in the first episode of the series, so if you haven't done already it is worth taking a look at that, and the link is in the video description below. So if you're still with me, Article 5 of the GDPR defines 7 core principles that detail the obligations of data controllers when processing personal data. So let's take a look at each of those principles, and as we do that we'll flag where the GDPR is broadly in line with the Data Protection Act and no action is likely to be needed, or whether action is likely to be required for organisations to become compliant with that principle of GDPR. So principle 1 then is the principle of lawfulness, fairness and transparency, specifically that personal data should be processed lawfully, fairly and in a transparent manner. Now, this is fairly self-explanatory and it's very similar to the provisions of the current Data Protection Act in that personal data must be processed lawfully and fairly. GDPR does, though, also add a new requirement here for transparency, which may mean that additional measures need to be taken by organisations, for example, by telling individuals what their personal data will be used for. Principle 2 then is the principle of purpose limitation, that personal data should be collected for specified legitimate purposes and not further processed in ways incompatible with those purposes. So fundamentally, data controllers must state the basis for collecting an individual's personal data and not use it in any other ways. And we'll talk more about the legitimate basis for processing personal data in the next episode. But in terms of impact, this provision is very similar to the current provisions of the Data Protection Act. And although GDPR adds the requirement for data archived or kept for scientific, historical or statistical purposes should be safeguarded from risk to the individual's privacy, there aren't really any changes likely to be necessary for most organisations. The third principle then is the principle of data minimization, specifically that personal data should be adequate, relevant and limited to what is necessary for the purposes of processing. Now, GDPR here goes a bit further than the Data Protection Act, in that the DPA's requirement is only that excessive personal data should not be held for the purposes of processing. GDPR, on the other hand, stipulates that only personal data that is necessary for processing can be held. And that's likely to mean that many organisations will need to review the personal data that they currently process to ensure that it meets the new requirement of being necessary for processing. Principle 4 is the principle of accuracy, and specifically that personal data should be accurate, kept up to date, and that every reasonable step must be taken to ensure that personal data that are inaccurate are erased or rectified without delay. Now, again, fairly self-explanatory insofar as data controllers have responsibility to ensure that the data they process is accurate so as not to impact the rights or freedoms of an individual. And although GDPR does now specify that reasonable measures must be taken to rectify or delete inaccurate personal data without delay, there's not really any change there from the existing provisions of the Data Protection Act, and it's unlikely that any actions will be required by most organisations. So next then is the principle of storage limitation, that personal data shouldn't be held for longer than is necessary for the purposes for which the data is processed, although it may be stored for longer periods for archiving in the public interest, scientific or historical research or statistical purposes. So the principle of storage limitation is broadly in line with existing provisions of the Data Protection Act. However, we do need to take into account GDPR's right to be forgotten. Now, we'll look at that later in the series, but essentially that means that individuals' data may need to be deleted earlier than any planned retention period. So again, potential action required there. Then we have the principle of integrity and confidentiality. that personal data shall be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security against unauthorised or unlawful processing and against accidental loss, destruction or damage using appropriate technical or organisational measures. So in other words, security of personal data is core to the principles of GDPR and is also a fundamental obligation of data controllers. But other than further highlighting the importance of securing personal data, there aren't really any material changes here compared to the Data Protection Act as it currently stands. And finally then, we have the principle of accountability, specifically that the data controller should be responsible for and be able to demonstrate compliance with the principles. Now, if we compare that to the Data Protection Act, GDPR adds in the requirement here for data controllers to be able to demonstrate their compliance with the principles that we've discussed. And this may require organisations to review the systems and processes that they currently have in place, and also their ability to analyse and monitor those processes. So we'll flag that as an action required for many organisations. So there was quite a lot of detail there. So before we finish, we'll do a quick recap of those key GDPR principles and where action may be required to become compliant. So first, we've got the principle of lawfulness, fairness and transparency, and actions potentially required there to explain to individuals how their personal data will be processed. The principle of purpose limitation, and no action likely to be required there, as this is pretty much in line with the Data Protection Act as it currently stands. The principle of data minimization, which is likely to require action to validate that data meets the new definition of being necessary for processing. The principle of accuracy, and again, no action probably necessary here for most organisations. The principle of storage limitation, and action is likely to be needed here to account for the new right to be forgotten. The principle of integrity and confidentiality. And again, no significant change here over and above the Data Protection Act, and so no action necessary for most organisations. And then finally, the principle of accountability. And this is likely to require action in order for organisations to be able to demonstrate compliance with the principles of GDPR. So that about wraps up the episode, and hopefully you found it useful. Next time we'll take a look at what can be used as a lawful basis for processing personal data under GDPR. So remember to subscribe to the Tisski YouTube channel, and as always, thank you for watching.